Landlord kicks out old couple for profit. But he didn't see this coming. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The rain had started again. A soft drizzle, barely enough to soak your shoulders, but enough to make the air feel heavy. Margaret Lane sat curled on the faded floral couch in her tiny living room, a worn Afghan draped over her knees. Her husband, Earl, stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the street outside with the quiet alertness of a man who once drove delivery trucks through every kind of weather and never missed a shift. Their apartment, nestled in a 2-story building that had stood in the neighborhood for over 70 years, was small and modest, just like the two of them. They'd lived there for 26 years, raised their only daughter here, watched the seasons change through that front window, celebrated anniversaries in the creaky kitchen, grieved losses in the silence of their bedroom. This wasn't just a place. It was home. But now, it was all about to disappear. "I don't like this, Maggie," Earl said without turning around. "Betta letter said we got 30 days. That's it, 30. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "And he's just trying to scare us. He knows we've been here forever. We always pay on time. He can't just throw us out like garbage." Earl turned to face her. "We both know how this works now. Rent's going up all over. He wants more money. And we're just in the way." A knock at the door cut through the room like a cold wind. Margaret sat up straighter. Earl moved slowly toward the door, his back stiff. When he opened it, there stood a man in a perfectly tailored wool coat, dark umbrella in hand. In his mid-30s, slick hair, smug smile. It was Alan Keating, the new landlord. "And Mr. and Mrs. Lane," he said brightly, as if reading off a script. "Good to see you. Thought I'd stop by in person." Earl didn't move. "But me got your letter." Great," Alan said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. He looked around, eyeing the fraying edges of the carpet and the yellowing wallpaper. "This place has charm." Margaret rose from the couch, clutching her shawl. "And we've kept it clean. We've taken care of it." Alan smiled thinly. Sure, but listen, this isn't personal. It's just business. You've been paying $1,200 a month for years. The going rate around here is almost double that now. I'm renovating the units, bringing in new tenants who can pay market value. You two, well, you understand." Earl's jaw clenched. "When we're not squatters. We've paid rent for over 2 decades. You think we can just pack up our lives and find something else like that?" He snapped his fingers. Alan shrugged. "When there's senior housing, government programs, I hear there's help if you look for it. Again, nothing personal. It's just time to make this building work for me." Silence fell heavy in the room. Margaret stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You're evicting us so you can make more money." He gave her that same rehearsed smile. "That's one way to look at it. Or, improving the neighborhood, increasing value, offering upgrades. It's progress." Earl stepped closer. "Progress that leaves people behind isn't progress." Alan glanced at his watch. "Well, you've got 28 days now. I'll need the keys then. I wish you both the best." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging slightly behind him. The days that followed were sleepless. Margaret spent hours on the phone. HUD programs, senior assistance lines, subsidized housing wait lists. Everything was either full, closed, or had years-long waiting lists. Earl walked the neighborhood looking for signs, but every place wanted a credit check, a security deposit, first and last month's rent, things they didn't have. Their daughter, Amanda, lived 3 states away with her husband and 3 kids. She offered to help, but they couldn't squeeze into her 2-bedroom house, and Margaret refused to become a burden. "Key's counting on this," Earl said one morning, his voice hoarse. "It wants us to leave quietly. No fuss, just vanish." Margaret looked at him, eyes tired but fierce. "We're not going to vanish." They started talking to neighbors, people who had watched them water their plants, sweep their sidewalk, wave hello on quiet mornings. Most had no idea the Lanes were being forced out. A few had even faced the same situation in nearby buildings. All of them, powerless. All of them, afraid. One afternoon, while walking back from the bus stop, Margaret saw Alan standing outside with a contractor, pointing at the windows of their unit. She stopped behind a tree, just close enough to hear. "Yeah, this one's almost ready to go. Once they're out, gut the place. New appliances, hardwoods, smart locks, jack up the rent to $2,500 easy. Tech guys eat that up." Margaret's chest tightened. The man had plans for every inch of their home, and they were nothing more than an obstacle in the way. She walked back, slower than usual. Earl was waiting by the steps. He was out there again, she said, talking like we don't even exist. Earl looked at her for a long moment. Maybe it's time we remind him we do. That night they sat down at the kitchen table, the same one they bought from a yard sale in '89, and began to write. Letters, emails, posts. Earl contacted the local tenants union. Margaret reached out to a journalist she'd seen do a segment on housing displacement. They spoke to a friend from church who knew someone on the city council. Every call, every email, every conversation was a thread, and slowly those threads began to pull together. It was a desperate effort, but it was something. Then came the moment they didn't expect. A knock on the door. Margaret opened it to find a young woman with a camera crew behind her. She smiled warmly and extended a hand. I'm Lisa from Channel 6. I heard about your story. Mind if we talk? Margaret stared for a moment before nodding. Earl stepped into the hallway behind her, eyes wide. And just like that, the fight they never meant to have was no longer just theirs. When the news segment aired, everything changed. It was a quiet Tuesday evening. Earl and Margaret sat side by side on their old couch, watching themselves on the local Channel 6 news. Lisa, the reporter, had been kind and respectful, letting them speak without interruption. The camera panned over the apartment's worn corners and faded curtains, capturing its quiet dignity. It showed Margaret's trembling hands as she held the eviction notice, and Earl's steady voice as he explained the landlord's plan to double the rent by forcing them out. Lisa's voiceover cut in. Ain't a retired delivery driver and a former librarian, married 42 years, never missed a rent payment. Now they're being asked to leave their home of nearly 3 decades, all in the name of profit. The piece ended with a slow shot of the couple standing in front of the building, holding hands. Within hours, their phones started ringing. Not just friends or neighbors, but strangers. People from across the city who had seen the segment and felt something stir. An elderly man from Queens who'd faced the same situation. A young woman who'd watched her grandmother be evicted in a similar way. A teacher who said she cried during the broadcast and wanted to help. Earl sat back, stunned. Maggie, we started something. By the end of the week, the building was no longer quiet. Activists showed up first, some from the tenants union Earl had called, others who'd simply seen the story online. They brought signs, set up folding chairs, and handed out flyers to neighbors who paused on the sidewalk. Housing is a human right. One sign read, "Protect the elders of our community." Read another. Then came the journalists, not just local reporters, but bloggers, independent media outlets, and even a young producer from a national podcast. Everyone wanted to talk to the couple who refused to go quietly. Margaret, nervous at first, found her voice in the chaos. "It's not just about us," she told a reporter, "and it's about what's happening to people all over this city. They're pushing out the very people who built these communities. For what? Trendy coffee shops and granite countertops?" The media ate it up. Meanwhile, Alan Keating was nowhere to be seen, but he was definitely watching. Inside his downtown office, Alan sat with his jaw tight, scrolling through the comments on the news station's Facebook post. Thousands of shares, hundreds of angry comments. How heartless can one person be? This is what greed looks like. And shame on him. Hope his karma comes fast. His assistant, Rachel, hovered in the doorway. An media's calling. So is the city housing board. Alan tossed his phone onto his desk. Let them. They'll forget by next week. Rachel hesitated. Actually, the building inspector called too. He wants to review the permits you filed, and there's talk of a rally outside tomorrow. You might want to be there. Alan ran a hand through his hair. Great, just great. For the first time, his plan didn't feel so clean. He'd bought the building 6 months ago as a low-effort investment. Raise rents, update the units, flip it in 5 years. That was the formula. It always worked. But this wasn't supposed to happen. He glanced back at the screen, where Margaret Lane's face stared out at him with quiet dignity. "I don't need this headache," he muttered. The next day, the rally happened. More than 50 people gathered in front of the Lanes building, some with signs, others just standing in solidarity. Local musicians played. Neighbors spoke. A few people brought food and folding chairs for Margaret and Earl, who sat under a large umbrella in the afternoon sun. It was Earl who took the microphone last, standing with both hands gripping the sides of the podium. "So didn't expect this," he began. "I didn't want it either. All we wanted was to live out our days in peace. But when you're pushed into a corner, sometimes you find your voice, and sometimes people listen." Cheers erupted from the crowd. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "And we're not the only ones," he continued. "There are folks being priced out of this city every day, quietly, silently, one by one. But not today. Today we say no." From across the street, Alan stood inside a coffee shop, watching through the window. A knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't the small-time couple he thought he could brush aside. This was something bigger now, a movement, a message, and his name was tied to it. That night, Alan met with his lawyer. "I need a legal way to end this. Fast," Alan said, pacing the office. The lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 50 seconds, shook his head. "So serve them notice legally. But now, with all this heat, you try to evict them now, the city could issue a stay. Or worse, they could launch a formal investigation into your renovations." Alan frowned. "Into me?" "Into everything. Your permits, your tax filings, your building compliance. You've been playing fast and loose with your timelines, Alan. If they dig deep enough." Alan sat down, eyes narrowing. "This was supposed to be simple. Why does it always have to get messy?" The lawyer leaned forward. "Because you made it about money, and they made it about people." A few nights later, Margaret and Earl sat on the couch again, holding hands. It was quiet for once. No cameras, no interviews, just the two of them. "But you think it'll work?" Margaret asked softly. Earl looked at her, then out the window toward the front steps, where protest signs still leaned against the railing. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know we're not alone anymore. That means something." Just then, the doorbell rang. Earl rose, cautious. When he opened it, Alan Keating stood on the other side. No coat, no umbrella, just a folder in his hands and an expression that had lost all its smugness. "Evening," Alan said, clearing his throat. "Can I come in?" Margaret stood, tense. Earl didn't move. "What do you want?" Alan held out the folder. "A revised agreement. I've decided not to go forward with the eviction. You can stay. No rent increase, no renovations." Margaret blinked. "Why the change of heart?" Alan hesitated. "Because I underestimated you, and because I made this personal when I said it wasn't." Earl took the folder but didn't open it. Alan looked around the familiar apartment, then back at them. "This place, your home. It's worth more than I realized, and not just in dollars." He nodded once, then turned and left. Margaret slowly sat down, the tension slowly melting off her shoulders. Earl placed the folder on the table, untouched. They didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They just sat there in quiet disbelief. It wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. For a while, things settled, or at least they appeared to. The eviction notice had been rescinded. Alan Keating hadn't been seen near the building since his surprise visit. The folder with the new agreement sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Margaret finally opened it, hands trembling. It was real, all of it. A signed letter from Alan stating that their lease would be extended indefinitely under the current rate. No renovations, no threats, no loopholes. But Earl didn't feel relief. He felt a different kind of weight settling on his chest. "This can't be the end," he said one evening, standing by the window as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the living room. I didn't back down because he suddenly cares. He backed down because people were watching. Margaret nodded slowly. Her knitting needles paused mid-stitch. He's waiting for it to quiet down. Let a few months pass, then try again when no one's looking. That fear of being forgotten was real. They had tasted power in their unity with others, but it was fragile, temporary. Then, an unexpected envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a stack of documents. Printouts, leaked emails, copies of city inspection reports, old renovation permits with suspicious stamps, and most damning, an internal memo from Alan's real estate group referring to certain longtime tenants as non-revenue obstacles. Earl read it twice, jaw tightening with each page. Who sent this? There was no note, but someone had clearly decided to speak up. Margaret clutched one of the pages. "Look at this. He's been cutting corners for years. No permits for electrical rewiring. Fire escapes never inspected. This isn't just about us. He's been putting lives at risk." Earl didn't hesitate. "We take this to Lisa." The second news story aired 2 days later. It was more than just a follow-up. It was an exposé. Lisa's voice, firm and deliberate, narrated the story as photos and documents flashed across the screen. And what started as an eviction of one elderly couple has unraveled into something far more troubling. According to recently leaked documents, Keating Properties has operated with questionable practices for years, illegally bypassing inspections, falsifying renovation permits, and targeting long-term tenants to boost short-term profits. They showed interviews with former tenants, young couples, single mothers, veterans. All had similar stories. Rent hikes, illegal evictions, unsafe renovations done while people were still living in the units. And now, thanks to Margaret and Earl's bravery, the stories were finally being told. The ripple had become a wave. Back in his office, Alan was spiraling. Emails were flooding in. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His name was now plastered across headlines, accompanied by phrases like "a corrupt practices" and "a predatory landlord." He slammed the door behind him and cursed under his breath. Rachel, his assistant, stepped in cautiously. The city has launched a formal investigation. They're reopening your permits, and the tenants' union is now pushing for a class action lawsuit. Alan threw a folder across the room. How the hell did this happen? It was just one couple, one stupid story. Rachel stared at him, something different in her eyes now. Less fear, more clarity. And they weren't stupid, and they weren't alone. For a moment, he looked at her like he didn't recognize her. Then he slumped into his chair, silent. Meanwhile, Earl and Margaret were no longer just tenants. They had become symbols. The community that once passed them by now greeted them by name. Strangers brought meals. Neighbors dropped off thank you cards. A local bakery even created a Maggie muffin, a warm apple cinnamon treat in her honor. But more than all that, real change was beginning to take root. A city councilwoman reached out. She wanted to meet. "Once I saw the story," she said, shaking Earl's hand in the small cafe on Main Street. "We need to put new protections in place for long-term tenants. People like you shouldn't have to fight this hard just to stay in your homes." Earl looked at Margaret, who gave a small, knowing nod. "Well, then let's make sure no one else has to," Earl said. And just like that, the fight that began in their modest apartment stretched beyond their street. But not everyone celebrated. One morning, a maintenance worker from the building approached Earl quietly in the hallway. "Mr. Lane," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "And I don't mean to pry, but there's talk. Alan's looking to sell. Word is, he's trying to offload the whole building before the lawsuits catch up." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Who's buying?" "Don't know. But I heard he's desperate. Might even sell it under market value just to get out fast." The next day, Margaret made a phone call she never thought she'd make. Amanda, their daughter, arrived by train the following weekend. She stepped into the apartment with her youngest in tow, looking around with a soft smile. "Still smells like coffee and wood polish," she said, hugging her mother. They sat down at the kitchen table, Earl, Margaret, Amanda, and her husband over Zoom. Papers were spread out, each one stamped, signed, and witnessed. "We've talked it over," Amanda said. "And we're going to help you buy the building." Margaret gasped. "What? Not just for you?" "For the others, too," Amanda continued. "So if Alan's desperate to sell, we can take it off his hands. And you two, you'll manage it. You already do. We'll take care of the financial side and you stay right here. But now, it'll be yours." Earl's mouth opened, then closed. For once, he was speechless. "You're not just fighting to stay anymore," Amanda said gently. "Well, you're fighting to protect others. And we're with you." Margaret wiped her eyes. "And you were always a good daughter." Amanda smiled. "And you were always good parents." "It's our turn now." 1 week later, the offer was made. Alan didn't even try to negotiate. The moment he saw the numbers and the legal name attached, Amanda Green, he folded. The sale was finalized in less than a month. The apartment building was now officially under new ownership. And its new managers? Earl and Margaret Lane. Not out of pity, not because they needed charity, but because they had proven they were the heart and soul of the place, and no one could manage it better than them. The day they changed the sign outside, the tenants gathered on the front steps. Margaret stood beside Earl, a fresh clipboard in hand, and reading glasses perched on her nose. "First order of business," she announced with a playful grin. "In rent stays the same. Second, everyone gets the emergency contact list, and we'll be forming a tenant committee next month." Cheers erupted. The couple who were almost pushed out were now protecting everyone else from the same fate. And as the sun set over the street they had called home for so many years, Earl wrapped an arm around Margaret's shoulder. "When we didn't just save our home," he said quietly. Margaret leaned into him, eyes glistening. "When we built something bigger." The first tenant meeting was held in the courtyard on a sunny Saturday morning. There were folding chairs borrowed from the local church, a table covered in donuts and paper coffee cups, and the faint hum of conversation between neighbors who had never spoken to each other before. Earl stood at the front, Margaret by his side with a small notepad and a soft smile. Her glasses glinted in the sun as she squinted at the turnout. Nearly every tenant had shown up. Even the ones who used to nod and pass silently in the halls were here now, bringing their stories, their concerns, their hope. Earl cleared his throat and looked out at the familiar faces. "We've lived in this building for over 40 years, he began. "Some of you have just moved in. Some have been here even longer. But today, for the first time, we're not just tenants in a building we don't control. We're a community, one that protects its own." There was a murmur of agreement. Margaret spoke next, her voice gentle but firm. "There's no reason anyone should live in fear of losing their home, not because of greed, not because of lies. We've seen what happens when people are silenced. We've seen what happens when we stay quiet. That ends now." She glanced down at her notepad. "We'll be forming a tenants committee. We'll meet monthly to address repairs, safety, accessibility, and anything else people want to bring to the table. This is your home too. Let's take care of it together." A young mother in the front row, Camila, raised her hand. "I've been scared since the day we moved in. When I heard what happened to you two, I started packing boxes, but now, this is the first time I feel safe." Earl nodded. "That's the idea." Camila smiled, her toddler climbing into her lap. "I'd like to volunteer for the committee." More hands went up. One by one, people claimed their place in something bigger than themselves. The crowd didn't disperse quickly. They lingered, talking, laughing, connecting. It wasn't just about rent anymore. It was about belonging. Meanwhile, Alan Keating's name had vanished from the building records. He had sold off several of his properties in a quiet panic, trying to stay ahead of the lawsuits and mounting public outrage. But the damage had been done. His reputation was in shambles. The name that once commanded respect in real estate circles was now synonymous with exploitation and shady business practices. One morning, Rachel, his former assistant, appeared in a televised interview. "And I stayed because I needed the job," she said, holding back emotion. "But every time I sent out an eviction notice that felt wrong, it chipped away at me." When Earl and Margaret spoke up, something shifted. It gave people like me the courage to walk away. Viewers flooded the comments with support. The dominoes kept falling. Investigations opened, laws were rewritten, and the city council passed new ordinances protecting long-term renters and penalizing predatory evictions. Alan tried to lay low, but his name was etched into the very reforms meant to stop landlords like him. It wasn't jail, but it was justice in its own quiet way. Back at the apartment, Margaret and Earl adjusted to their new roles. They weren't just managers, they were mentors. Margaret worked with a local nonprofit to offer budgeting classes to tenants. Earl partnered with a handyman named Luis to form a maintenance rotation, prioritizing elderly and disabled residents. One afternoon, Amanda visited again, this time with the whole family. Her kids ran down the hallway with the same joy Earl used to feel as a boy in his childhood home. "Still can't believe this is yours," Amanda said, standing in the middle of the courtyard as the sun cast warm rays across the benches Earl had built with Luis. "It's all of ours," Earl said. "But that's the point." Amanda looked at her parents with pride. "Then you didn't just fight back. You built something better." Margaret took her hand. "Because we couldn't have done it without you." Amanda grinned. "I'm just glad the kids get to see what resilience looks like." That night, Earl sat on the balcony, sipping his tea. He watched the lights come on in windows across the courtyard, families sharing meals, students finishing homework, an older man playing a gentle tune on a saxophone. He thought about how close it all came to disappearing, how close he and Margaret came to becoming another story lost in the shuffle. But they hadn't just held on. They'd changed the story entirely. Margaret stepped out, placing a soft blanket over his shoulders before sitting beside him. The cool breeze rustled the leaves in the old elm tree just outside the fence. "We're not done, are we?" she asked. Earl smiled. "Nope, not by a long shot." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "Good. I like who we're becoming." Months passed. The building once known for silence and tension now echoed with life. Movie nights in the courtyard, potlucks in the community room, children's drawings taped to the elevator walls. The Maggie muffin at the bakery across the street became a neighborhood favorite. And every now and then, new tenants would ask Earl about the framed photo in the lobby, the one of him and Margaret, standing strong in front of the old building with the headline from the local paper, "Upple Sparks Tenant Revolution." He'd smile and say, "And that was the day we remembered who we were." In the fall, a community mural was painted along the building's side wall, dozens of hands contributing brushstrokes. It depicted a simple scene, an older couple holding the keys to a building, surrounded by people of all ages and backgrounds, standing together. At the top it read, "A home is not just where we live, it's where we stand together." And beneath that, in smaller letters, "Inspired by Margaret and Earl Lane." They had once been almost invisible. Now, their story lived on every brick, every hallway, every neighbor's smile. Because they hadn't just kept their home, they made it a sanctuary, and that was something no landlord could ever take away.